They tell you, when you sign up to be a ranger, that the wilderness will change you. They don't just mean the long hikes or the endless storms or the solitude that cuts down to your bones. They mean the way it shifts something inside you, how you start seeing the world through different eyes. When I first came to Montana as a young ranger, I thought it was the danger I had to worry about. Mountain lions, blizzards, the cold indifference of nature. But after nearly 2 decades patrolling these forests, I learned something else. Danger is real, yes, but so is mercy. And sometimes, mercy comes from the last place you'd expect. It was late summer, the kind of morning when the sky hangs low with a pearl-colored mist and the river seems to glow silver. I was walking a familiar stretch along the flathead, boots sinking into soft mud, the smell of pine and wet earth thick in the air. That's when I saw him. At first, I thought it was just driftwood caught against the rocks, but then it moved. A massive grizzly, scarred, filthy, limping, waded into the shallows. He swung a heavy paw at the water, missed the trout below, and stumbled sideways, almost collapsing. Grizzlies don't miss. Not like that. My chest tightened. His left shoulder looked wrong, twisted at an angle that no healthy bear could manage. Old wounds matted his fur with blood and dirt. He looked like he hadn't eaten in days, maybe weeks. For a ranger, this is the moment we're trained for. You don't interfere, you observe. You let the wild sort itself out. That's the code. But standing there, watching this great beast flail in the river like a dying old man, I felt something stir in me I couldn't push aside. I reached into the creel slung across my shoulder. Inside was my morning catch, 3 rainbow trout, slick and fat. I pulled out the largest, still twitching faintly, and tossed it onto the rocks a few yards from him. The bear froze. His nose twitched. He turned that massive head toward me, eyes dark and unreadable. Then he limped forward, seized the fish in his jaws, and tore into it with a hunger that made my stomach twist. For a long time, I just stood there, listening to the crunch of bones, the tearing of flesh. Then he lifted his head, blood and scales dripping from his muzzle, and looked at me again. That was the beginning. The next morning, I half expected the whole thing to feel like a dream. Maybe I'd convince myself I'd fed a bear just to ease my conscience. But when I came back to the same stretch of river, he was there again. This time, he wasn't struggling so much. He waded in, swiped once, and missed again. His limp was worse. I stood on the bank, my fishing pole balanced across my knees, and I felt the same tug in my gut as before. I pulled up a trout, fat and silver, wriggling in my hands. Without thinking too much about it, because thinking too much would have stopped me, I tossed it toward the rocks. The bear's ears twitched. He lumbered over, seized the trout, and devoured it like he'd been waiting for me. When he finished, he looked up at me. Not aggressive, not fearful, just watching. That became our ritual. Every patrol, every trip to the river, I gave him something. The biggest fish of my haul. Always the biggest, like I owed it to him. He never growled, never charged, never turned away. He just took what I offered. At first, I told myself it was temporary, just until his shoulder healed enough that he could hunt for himself again. But deep down, I knew it was more than that. He began to wait for me. Sometimes I'd spot him on the ridge above the river, his silhouette massive against the sky. Sometimes he'd appear out of the trees as I was packing up, a quiet presence, patient. Then came the day he followed me home. I'd finished a long shift and returned to my cabin in the clearing. I just split the last of my firewood and was wiping sweat from my brow when I felt it, the heavy, deliberate weight of eyes on my back. I turned slowly, every instinct telling me to grab the axe in the stump beside me, and there he was, the bear, standing at the edge of the clearing, half in the shadows. For a long moment, neither of us moved. My heart hammered in my chest. If he came closer, if he decided I wasn't a friend but prey, I'd have no chance. But he didn't charge. He didn't growl. He sat down, like he'd been invited. I don't know what possessed me, but I went inside, rummaged through the cupboards, and came back with a small jar of honey. I set it on the ground a dozen feet from my porch and stepped back. He sniffed, lumbered over, and licked it clean. Then, without as much as a glance, he rose and padded back into the tree line. That night I lay awake, staring up the cabin ceiling, replaying every second. A grizzly had traced me home. A grizzly had eaten from my porch, and I wasn't afraid. Not like I should have been. It wasn't a friendship, not yet, but it was something close, something I couldn't name. The weather had been turning all week. By the third day of September, the sky hung low and mean, swollen with black clouds. I knew the mountains well enough to read the signs. A storm was coming, and it would be a rough one. I packed my truck early that morning. Chainsaw, rope, first aid kit, and supplies for a long shift patrolling the ridges. Storms had a way of bringing trouble. Hikers lost in the fog, fallen trees blocking service roads, cabins cut off from the main trails. It was my job to be out there, ready. The wind picked up as I rolled down the gravel road. Needles from the pines whipped across the windshield, hissing like sand. I gripped the wheel tighter, feeling the truck jolt against potholes. And then I heard it. The sharp, gut-deep crack of wood splitting under pressure. I barely had time to look up before the tree came down. It was a massive pine, old and rotten at the core. The storm wind had pried it loose and it toppled straight across the road. The impact was instant. The hood crumpled, glass shattered, metal screamed. The world slammed into me in a blur of noise and violence. Everything was tilted sideways. My ears rang. My face was wet with blood from a cut across my forehead. And my leg, God, my leg, was pinned beneath the dash. I screamed into the cab, the sound swallowed by the storm outside. My hands scrabbled against twisted metal, but every movement sent white-hot pain lancing through me. Adrenaline took over. Somehow, I managed to pry myself free, dragging my body out through the shattered passenger side. I collapsed onto the gravel, sucking air in shallow gasps. My right leg bent wrong, swollen and bleeding, bone pressing against skin. Broken. Bad. I lay there for what felt like hours, rain soaking through my clothes, pain blotting out the edges of my vision. The radio had been crushed in the crash. My phone was useless, no service this deep in the mountains. It was just me. Me, a broken leg, and miles of wilderness. I don't remember deciding to move. I just remember clawing forward, inch by inch, dragging myself across the gravel with my arms. Every time my leg shifted, I bit down on a scream. The storm raged above me. Branches cracked, lightning flashed, thunder rolled so loud it rattled my teeth. But I kept crawling. Because somewhere behind the trees, maybe a quarter mile up the slope, was my cabin. My only chance. By the time I reached the clearing, the world was spinning. My arms gave out and I collapsed in the wet grass, staring at the porch steps like they were the gates of heaven. Somehow I pulled myself up the last few feet, across the threshold, and slammed the door shut behind me. I was safe. Or so I thought. The cabin was barely more than a box of timber. One room, a stone fireplace, shelves lined with tools and canned goods. On a normal night, it felt cozy, a safe haven against the wild. But that night, it felt like a coffin. I crawled to the cot in the corner, every movement grinding the broken bones in my leg. My breaths came in short, Ragged bursts. Sweat chilled on my skin, even though the fire roared in the hearth. I tried to assess the damage. The leg was swollen to twice its size, the skin stretched tight and bruised black and purple. I had basic medical training, but no amount of ranger first aid could undo a fracture this bad. I tore a strip from my shirt, bound it as tight as I could, and prayed it would hold. The pantry wasn't much better. A half bag of rice, some beans, 2 jars of jam, a little jerky I'd been saving. Enough to last maybe 3-4 days if I rationed carefully. The realization hit me like another falling tree. If help didn't come soon, I wasn't going to make it. That night, the forest reminded me just how alone I was. It started with the howls. Distant at first, then closer. Wolves. Their cries echoed through the storm, sharp and hungry. I dragged myself to the window, pulled back the curtain with trembling fingers. Yellow eyes glowed in the tree line. My pulse hammered. The cabin was solid enough, but I knew what wolves could do. They were patient, cunning. If they scented blood, my blood, they'd circle until they found a weakness. Then came another sound, a deep, guttural growl that cut through the storm like thunder. I froze. My heart stopped. For one terrifying moment, I thought another predator had joined the hunt. But then, I saw him. The bear. He stood in the clearing, his massive frame silhouetted against the lightning. His fur bristled, teeth bared. He swung his head back and forth, roaring into the night. The wolves hesitated. One stepped forward, ears flat, teeth glinting. The bear lunged, slamming his paws into the mud with a force that shook the ground. The wolf yelped and darted back into the trees. One by one, their glowing eyes vanished into the dark. The howls faded, swallowed by the storm. And the bear stayed. Through the crack in the curtain, I watched him pace the clearing, circling the cabin, grunting low whenever the forest stirred. He was on guard, watching, protecting. I pressed my forehead to the cold glass, pain and relief mixing in my chest until I couldn't tell them apart. That night, I slept with the sound of his breathing outside my walls.
Morning came gray and cold. The fire had burned low, and the cabin smelled of smoke and damp wood. My body ached in every bone. My leg throbbed like it had a heartbeat of its own. Hunger gnawed at me. I forced myself upright, dragging to the window. The clearing was empty. The bear was gone. For the first time since the crash, the weight of true loneliness sank in. I was broken, trapped, and starving. The storm had knocked out any chance of hikers or patrols crossing this way soon. I pressed my hand against my stomach, hollow and weak. That's when I heard it. A heavy thump on the porch. I froze, my pulse spiking. Slowly, I dragged myself across the floor and unlatched the door. The cold air rushed in, biting at my skin. And there it was. A fish. Big, silver, fresh from the river, scales still glittering with morning dew. I stared at it, stunned. My breath caught in my throat. My eyes darted to the tree line, and for a moment, just a moment, I saw him. The bear. He stood in the shadows, watching, his head tilted, almost curious. Then with a slow, lumbering turn, he disappeared into the trees. I grabbed the fish with shaking hands, dragged it inside. My fingers trembled as I gutted it, the smell of raw flesh filling the cabin. I cooked it over the fire, every crackle of fat a hymn. When I took the first bite, tears burned my eyes. I hadn't realized just how close I was to giving up. The next day, it happened again. Another thump on the porch, another fish. And again the day after that. He was feeding me. The realization hit me like lightning. The same bear I had once fed, the broken creature limping in the river, was now carrying fish to my door. Day after day he came back, dragging the river's bounty to keep me alive. It was no accident, no coincidence. He remembered. Every trout I'd laid on the rocks for him, every kindness I had offered him. Now he was returning it with interest.
It was a cold, crisp morning when I first stood without collapsing. The fire had burned down to embers, smoke curling lazily through the cabin. My leg was stiff, swollen, and angry, but I had learned to ignore the pain, or at least work with it. I gripped my carved pine crutches, knuckles white, and shifted my weight carefully. Every step was agony, but each one was a victory. Outside, the forest was alive. A low mist hugged the pines, birds called from distant branches, and the river gurgled its constant, comforting song. I knew I was weak. I knew I could fall at any moment, but I also knew something else. I wasn't alone. I glanced toward the tree line. There he was, the bear. Massive and golden in the pale morning light, standing silent, still. Watching, waiting. It was as if he knew I could finally leave the cabin without crawling, knew I could take my first steps toward true survival. I stepped onto the porch, one crutch forward, then the other, my body trembling with effort. I winced as pain stabbed through my leg, but I held my breath and forced another step, and another. From the corner of my eye, I saw the bear shift, just slightly, his massive head tilting like he was studying me. The bond we had built, the trust, the loyalty, the sheer intelligence in his gaze, all of it crystallized in that moment. I limped down the small path toward the river, and the bear followed at a distance, keeping to the shadows, not too close, not too far, just enough that I knew he was there, my companion, my guardian. Days passed, and with each step I gained strength. I returned to the river, fishing again with my good arm, and he watched patiently from the bank. Sometimes he came close, dropping another fish at my feet, a reminder that our connection went beyond survival. It was friendship, forged in the rawest, most desperate of fires. The wolves still lurked at the edges of the forest, but now I faced them with a new courage. Not because I was stronger, I was far from it, but because I had learned the depth of loyalty and intelligence that nature could offer. I had a protector I could trust implicitly. And then, one evening, as the sun dipped behind the mountains, painting the world gold and crimson, I knew it was time. The bear nuzzled my hand, a final gesture of trust and understanding. His massive paw pressed gently against mine, and in that moment, I felt everything we had shared. Every fish, every act of mercy, every long night spent together in fear and pain. Then he turned, lumbering back into the forest. Not goodbye exactly, because some bonds never end, but a return to the wild where he belonged. I watched until he vanished, a golden shadow in the trees, and I knew I would never forget him. Some friendships aren't measured in words. They're measured in survival, in trust. In moments like this, when two unlikely souls look into each other's eyes and understand that life itself is precious. I had walked again. I had survived. And I had a story no one would ever believe, except me and the bear who had saved my life. I finally made it back to town weeks later. My crutches worn and splintered, my clothes ragged, my body thinner than it had been in years. Doctors shook their heads, friends stared, and neighbors whispered. They couldn't believe what I'd survived. A broken leg, a storm, nights alone with wolves circling, and the raw wilderness threatening to swallow me whole. I told them my story, about the accident, about crawling home barely alive, about the nights when hunger gnawed at me like a predator, about the wolves, about him, the bear. Some smiled politely, some chuckled, a few said outright that I must have been delirious from fever. But I knew the truth. I had seen the intelligence in those dark eyes, felt the trust, experienced the loyalty. The bear had saved my life. Not instinctively, not by chance. He had remembered my kindness, repaid it in the only way he could. And in the quiet moments that followed, I realized something else. Survival isn't always about strength or skill. Sometimes it's about connection. Sometimes it's about an act of mercy returned when you least expect it. I keep a photo on my wall now. Not of me, not of the cabin, but a shadow in the trees. Golden fur, glinting in the sun, massive paws resting lightly on the forest floor. Every time I look at it, I remember. Bears don't forget, and neither do I. That bear taught me more about life, loyalty, and the wild than I ever learned from books or patrols. He reminded me that even in the most unforgiving places, hope can appear. Sometimes in the form of something as improbable as a friend with fur, teeth, and a heart that understands more than ours ever could. I survived the forest, the storm, and the wolves, but more than that, I survived because something had watched over me. And that miracle, that bond, will stay with me forever. Because some stories are bigger than survival. They're about trust, courage, and the quiet miracles of the wild. And this one is mine.